Forget the mud of Agincourt, forget the glorious longbowmen and the heroic underdog victory. Agincourt is the battle everyone remembers, but it didn't conquer France. This did. In July 1418, Henry V stood before the most terrifying fortress in Europe. 60 towers, 180 guns, and 4,000 elite soldiers waiting to slaughter his men. A normal king would order a bloody charge. Henry was not a normal king. Instead of drawing his sword, he drew a circle. He built a machine around 70,000 people and simply waited. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the Siege of Rouen. Agincourt in 1415 is the battle everyone knows. The muddy field, the longbowmen, the flower of French chivalry cut down by men who should have been too sick and too outnumbered to win. It was a genuine tactical masterpiece. It was also by itself strategically incomplete. A battlefield victory 3 weeks' march from Paris, won by an army that immediately turned around and went home, changes nothing permanently. Henry knew this. He came back in 1417 with a different objective. Not to win a battle, but to take Normandy, hold it, and rule it. That project required a different kind of thinking entirely. Edward III had run campaigns in France before. Fast, devastating raids called chevauchées that swept through territory, created enormous disruption, and returned to England with plunder, but without anything permanent. Henry had no interest in disruption. He wanted territory he could administer, tax, and hold in perpetuity. For that you needed cities. For cities you needed sieges. And sieges required patience and organisation of a kind that raiding armies never needed. Caen fell in 1417. Falaise, Cherbourg, each one taken by the same method. Encirclement, systematic reduction, terms. The campaign moved south and east with the methodical rhythm of a project rather than a war. That project required Rouen. Rouen sat on the Seine between the English coast and Paris. Normandy's administrative capital, its wealthiest city, its military headquarters. The city had spent 3 years since Agincourt fortifying itself. 60 towers on the walls, each mounting artillery, a garrison of 4,000 regular soldiers, backed by 16,000 armed militia. The walls were thick enough to absorb bombardment. The Seine gave water and potentially supply. And within those walls were not just the garrison, but approximately 70,000 people. The original population swollen by refugees from everywhere the English advance had already reached. Henry arrived in late July 1418 and positioned his army in a ring around the city. His commanders each took responsibility for a section of the perimeter. His brother, the Duke of Clarence, to the west, Henry himself to the east, his uncle the Duke of Exeter controlling approaches from the north. The circle was drawn carefully, with overlapping fields of fire and supply lines running back to captured Norman towns. The scale of the engineering operation required to maintain this ring deserves attention. Henry's army was not simply camping outside a city, it was building a second city. A network of fortified positions, connected by patrol routes, supplied by wagons, moving along roads that Henry's engineers had maintained and repaired as the army advanced through Normandy. The records of the royal accounts show payments to carpenters, carters, and craftsmen stretching back through the whole campaign. Men employed not to fight, but to build the infrastructure that made fighting possible. When the royal accounts were settled later, the carpenters working on Rouen alone were found to have earned wages for months of continuous construction. This was not a medieval raid, it was a modern military administration in medieval clothes. Then Henry did something that required more engineering than fighting. The Seine was Rouen's lifeline. Supplies from Paris could come downriver. Supplies from the sea could come upriver. Cut both, and the city starved regardless of how strong its walls were. On the river below the city, Henry's engineers drove massive timber piles into the riverbed and stretched an iron chain across the full width of the Seine, blocking the channel entirely. English patrol boats were anchored above and below to catch anything that tried to pass. For the upstream problem, Henry had his smaller vessels physically lifted out of the river, carried overland past the section controlled by the city, and relaunched on the other side. English boats now patrolled the Seine, both above and below Rouen, simultaneously. Nothing moved on that river without English permission. The French inside had anticipated a frontal assault and prepared accordingly. What they had not prepared for was a siege conducted with this degree of engineering precision. The city had food for a long campaign, stored grain, cattle, stocks accumulated over months of preparation. Henry knew this. He was not in a hurry. The autumn and early winter passed in the rhythms of a siege. French sorties came out to probe the English lines. They were repulsed. English artillery fired against the walls. The French returned fire with their own guns. Neither side made decisive progress. A soldier named John Page, serving in the English army and writing down what he witnessed in verse, recorded the particular quality of a siege that both sides knew would be decided by hunger rather than assault. The way the waiting accumulated, the way men found ways to occupy themselves, the occasional courtly gesture that seemed absurd against the larger brutality of the situation. Garrison officers and English officers arranged single combats, the formal duels between individual knights that allowed men on both sides to demonstrate their personal honour, while the siege machinery ground on around them. By December, Rouen's food was gone. The city authorities faced a calculation with no good answer. The garrison could eat what remained and continue fighting, or the garrison could survive while other people died. They chose the second option. Somewhere between 10 and 12,000 people, the elderly, the ill, heavily pregnant women, young children, the poorest of the refugees who had arrived with nothing, were driven out through the city gates. The reasoning was direct. These people consumed food and contributed nothing to the defence. Without them, the garrison's supplies would last longer. With them inside, the city fell sooner. They walked out of the gates and into the space between the city walls and the English lines. Henry refused to let them through. His reasoning was equally direct and equally cold. If he allowed the expelled civilians to pass, he removed the burden from Rouen's defenders and extended the siege indefinitely. The people in the ditch were not his responsibility. They were a weapon being used against him, a weight the city was trying to shift from its own scales to his. He refused to accept the transfer. The English lines held. The people stayed where they were. John Page wrote about what he saw from the English side of those lines. He was not a propagandist. He was a soldier with a witness's eye, and what he wrote was unsparing. He described mothers holding children who had already died. People grown so thin that the word he used was like trees, the specific thinness of a living thing stripped back to nothing. He recorded individual scenes with a directness that sits uneasily in any century. Hunger of this severity dissolves the bonds between people, he wrote, in ways that ordinary hardship does not. He was watching from behind English lines, unable to intervene, writing it down because the act of writing was the only response available to him. For a single day, the horror paused. On Christmas Day, Henry briefly suspended the blockade. He sent his own priests into the ditch, bringing food and drink to the starving masses trapped between the lines. But the moment the holy day ended, the iron ring closed again. Page called Henry's Christmas gesture a fair grace. He meant it as a compliment to the king's mercy. What the gesture actually reveals is the precision of Henry's thinking. A ruler who understood that his reputation, both with his own soldiers and with the wider Christian world that would judge his actions, required a visible act of compassion, but who also understood that one day's mercy and 6 months of iron blockade were not in contradiction. The gesture was real. The calculation behind it was equally real. By January, the city's commanders had accepted that no relief was coming. The Duke of Burgundy, the obvious source of a rescue force, had replied to Rouen's increasingly desperate appeals by advising the city to look to its own resources. He had Paris to hold and his own enemies to manage. The city was alone. Negotiations began on New Year's Eve. The French asked for 10 days to see if any help arrived. None did. On January 19th, 1419, the Duke of Exeter rode into Rouen at the head of the English army, and the city capitulated. Henry's terms were not gentle. The city owed 300,000 gold crowns. an amount that would take years to extract. 80 of the leading citizens were taken as hostages against payment. The French garrison soldiers were stripped of their valuables and turned out of the city with 2 sous each for the road. Alain Blanchard, the commander of the militia who had organised the civilian defence throughout the siege, was executed for his role in causing English casualties during the months of resistance. Henry entered Rouen the following day and went directly to the cathedral to give thanks. Those who recorded the procession noted an unusual detail. Riding behind the king was a servant carrying a lance. Attached to the top of that lance, in place of the usual military standard, was a fox's tail. The French had previously mocked Henry, calling him a fox for his refusal to fight them in a straightforward, chivalric battle. Henry was now throwing the insult back in their faces. In medieval symbolism, the fox represented cunning, patience, and the ability to achieve through intelligence what brute force could not. Henry had spent 6 months waiting outside walls that his artillery could not breach. He had won not by storming the defences, but by controlling everything the city needed to survive. The fox's tail was a statement about method, and a calculated insult to the men who had underestimated it. Roun's fall had consequences that spread across France faster than any army could march. The news broke something psychological in the Norman towns and fortresses that remained. One after another, positions that had been prepared for resistance simply opened their gates. The calculation had changed. If Rouen, the most fortified city in Normandy, with its garrison and its walls and its months of stored supplies, could not hold out, then holding out was no longer a rational option. Henry swept up the remaining Norman territory with minimal further resistance. The pattern repeated itself across the duchy. English soldiers arriving at walls that had been built to resist, only to find gates being opened before they could settle in for another long siege. The reputation that Rouen had created preceded the army wherever it went. It is worth pausing on what Henry had actually accomplished by this point. In 1417 he had landed in Normandy with an army that his contemporaries considered well organised, but by no means overwhelming. By the spring of 1419, he controlled the entire duchy, except for the isolated coastal fortress of Mont Saint-Michel, which he simply bypassed. He had done this not through a succession of dramatic pitched battles, but through the patient reduction of fortified positions one by one, each operation using the administrative machinery and the engineering capacity developed in the previous one. Rouen was the climax of this campaign, and its fall was the proof that the method worked even against the most formidable opposition Normandy could offer. And then, less than a year after Rouen fell, something happened in France that handed Henry everything he could have hoped for without another siege. At Montereau Bridge, in September 1419, the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, who had done nothing to save Rouen, came to meet the Dauphin in negotiations intended to end the French Civil War. He was killed by the Dauphin's men during the meeting. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, did not forgive this. He turned to Henry. The alliance between England and Burgundy that followed put a vice around the French crown that could not be resisted. In May 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. The terms were extraordinary. Henry V was declared heir to the throne of France, regent for the incapacitated King Charles VI, and husband to the French princess Catherine. The Dauphin, the man whose supporters had arranged the killing at Montereau, was disinherited. The dual monarchy of England and France, which Henry's predecessors had spent a century claiming as a right, was written into law and signed by the French crown itself. The road from Rouen to Troyes runs through everything that happened in between. The fall of the remaining Norman fortresses, the psychological collapse of French resistance, the Montereau killing, and its diplomatic consequences, the Burgundian alliance. But none of it happens without Rouen. A France that could have pointed to Rouen holding out, the greatest city in Normandy, still unbroken after Henry's 6-month siege, might have found the confidence to resist the terms of Troyes. A France that had watched Rouen fall could not. Henry V died in 1422, aged 35, before he could take the French throne he had been promised. He left behind an infant heir and a position in France that would take another generation to unravel. What he had built, the systematic conquest of Normandy, the legal foundation of the Treaty of Troyes, the strategic reality of an England that held northern France, had required one indispensable operation. Agincourt gave Henry a famous victory. Rouen gave him a country. That's what happened at the Siege of Rouen.